Welcome to the Nocturnal YouTube channel, home of haunted tales. I'm Miles Boothe, and tonight is the second half of my story, Cairn Manor. On our return to the house, Celine saw me and motioned for me to join her. Her face was haggard. I followed her into a sitting room and she quietly shut the door before looking back at me. I have no right to ask you to stay. And if you decide to leave, you will be paid for your time, of course. Her eyes began to well with tears. But the children will only become more frightened without you here. My head swam in confusion. Why don't we all leave, Celine? Whatever that thing is, it's dangerous. We need to go. She sighed. I'm afraid that's not an option for me. The men who were here yesterday were lawyers. Ephthemios, my husband, left behind a substantial estate. As you might imagine, he was not planning to... Her throat closed and she took a moment. Nobody expected any of this to happen, and he didn't leave his accounts in order. The vultures that call themselves attorneys have raised issues, and I must act quickly and decisively if I'm going to preserve the children's future. I can't do that from a Holiday Inn. I didn't pretend to understand the complexities she was referring to, but I got the gist of it. All right, let's say I stay. I teach the children their lesson, and you can do what you need to do. Why can't we leave before it gets dark? Her eyes narrowed. Because I don't know what this thing is, but it has appeared at a highly suspicious time. What has happened, it makes no sense, and that does make sense to me in my predicament. I will not be run away from my home, Will. This is my children's home. I'm not certain who I can trust anymore, so I'm making the choice to not depend on trust at all. To that end, I have multiple meetings arranged today, as well as an appointment with a security company to install cameras and alarms. Whoever this mysterious intruder is, I will have them on camera if they return tonight. She was clearly upset, and I didn't want to argue with her logic, such as it was. Okay, I'm staying. Let me know what I can do to help. Her face relaxed just a bit. Thank you. You must understand that there are those who work against me. Ephthemios was Greek, but I am French. Most of his family embraced our marriage, but some did not, and they did not look any more kindly upon the children. Please just help me to look out for Ermi and Sophie. That's the most important thing you can do by far. The children were a mess. They were upset, and deservedly so. Yaya was not much better, though her bluff and bluster was more up to par, and she was finally able to calm them enough to study. We went through our lessons with grim determination, but it was a near Herculean task to avoid mention of the intruder. Ermi was the most frightened, and it was impossible to get him to settle down. He waited until Yaya left the room, and then he launched into a description of what he thought the monster looked like. I had no idea what to do, so I didn't stop him, hoping that maybe in talking about it he might feel better. Unfortunately, he only became more animated. It's not a monster, Ermi, Sophie said, who had been silent during her brother's outburst, but seemingly had had enough. She continued in a droll tone. It's a ghost. I was taken aback. Sophie, why do you say that? She looked at me with her scrutinizing expression. I heard Mother say it. I raised my eyebrows in genuine shock and scrambled for some sort of rational way to counter this. I think she must have been talking about something else. She shook her head. No, it was when she was on the phone with the man who was coming here. She said that she found Baba's papers and that it was a ghost. I was again at a loss for words, and had Yaya not chosen that moment to return, I'm not sure what I could have said. The child's words sent chills racing through me, not for the least reason that the explanation echoed my own instincts. As their grandmother took her seat, the children bowed heads to books, feigning study. I silently thanked my co-conspirators for their ruse and did the same while I collected my thoughts. By lunch, Tom, Jen, and Henri had moved on from speculating on what it could be and graduated to this problem will soon be solved. The hope was that the new security system would be our savior. and that there was certainly no shortage of overall uniformed men installing cameras throughout the home. The owner of the security company had arrived to personally assure Celine that absolutely nothing or nobody stood any chance of roaming the hallways undetected. I had my doubts, but I did fully plan to be glued to the newly installed bank of television monitors this evening, just in case. Celine continued her meetings, and we continued our lessons until it was well into the late afternoon, when the children and I finished. Yaya took them for a nap, as none of us had gotten any rest, and I considered doing the same when Tom appeared from around a corner and motioned for me. He didn't say a word, he just waved at me to follow him, and we slipped out of a back entrance. Once outside, he told me what he had found. It's another cairn, in a spot I passed by just days ago, and it wasn't there then. I was confused, and I didn't bother to try hiding it. It doesn't make any sense. Even if Celine's theory is true and someone is trying to scare her and us, why hide these things where we may not find them? He was shaken. I don't know. I just know that they weren't here before all of this began. We made it to the second cairn, a taller version of the first. It was more remote, and there were more rocks about, so I suppose that made sense in a weird way. Tom looked at me with the obvious question that I put into words. You think we should take one down? He shrugged. I walked around it, peering at its base. There were no signs of digging, or of anything other than the fact that rocks had been piled, one upon another, to form a crude tower. I shook my head. Let's not. There's no reason to think that anything is under there, and until we know what they are, I just don't think we should mess with them. Did you have a chance to look around to make sure that there are no others? He nodded that he had. Been out here all day. If there was another one within a half a mile, I would have found it. I nodded. Okay. I say we go back, have dinner, get the family settled in, and then we can take shifts watching those monitors. Dinner went smoothly, if not happily, and as Henri served coffee, he gave me a subtle nod, and I knew that Tom had recruited him. I briefly considered Celine's concern that she didn't know who she could trust, but I just couldn't believe that anyone in the house was moving against her. Tom and Jen excused themselves, and shortly after, Yaya collected the children. When they were all gone, Celine turned to me and gave a weak smile. The meetings went well today. Thank you for staying. It meant a great deal. I stood up, walked to the wine decanter, and I lifted it in question. She smiled and shook her head no, but I tipped the crystal towards my own glass and filled it by half. I didn't really know what else to say, so I asked about the cameras. Do they cover every hallway? She nodded. Yes, in all of the common rooms. Anything that happens here tonight will be in living color, recorded for posterity, and I made certain that the lawyers were all made aware of that. I'll be surprised if we're disturbed at all. She was either lying, overconfident, or depending on blind hope, but she seemed certain that she had solved the problem, and I could see that she was done with it. There had been too much stress, too many nasty shocks, and the strain of it all had taken its toll. I questioned what kind of life it must be to live in that way. I have a favor to ask of you. I looked up, aware that I had been lost in my own thoughts. And I was caught. I smiled. Sorry, I was just thinking. She smiled in return. Tomorrow, a man will be here to appraise some of the items that Ephemios collected. The appointment is scheduled during the time we usually schedule for lunch, but I do not want the children to be around this man. Would it be too much for you to ask to take your break in the children's study? That's no trouble at all, I said, thinking nothing of it. But she wasn't finished. I would also ask that you find a way to keep Yaya there as well. She paused, searching for words. It's a very unusual situation, and one I know that she would not approve of. I would spare her the grief of knowing what her son had been involved in. I didn't understand, and she clearly had no intention of explaining it further, so I acquiesced, and that was that. She thanked me as she rose from her seat, bid me good night, and left for the evening. She had only been gone a few moments when Henri stepped out of the kitchen and said quietly, Monsieur Tom, and motioned toward the hallway. I understood and made my way toward the room where the monitors had been set up. Tom was already there, fidgeting with settings and knobs. He showed me how to move the cameras and then asked if I minded taking the first shift. I hadn't slept, and if the events of the past 2 nights were repeated, I wouldn't have the chance to do so until dawn. But I was wired from stress and the mystery surrounding everything, and I agreed. I figured I couldn't fall asleep anyway. It was 4 hours later when Tom woke me by nudging my shoulder. I slowly regained my wits and looked at the monitors, but none of the alarms were flashing. Nothing had happened. "I can take it from here," he said. "You go get some rest." I nodded sleepily and planned to do exactly that, when the sound of a shattering glass jar exploded through the night, jolting me instantly awake. I bolted out of the chair, heart pounding against my ribs as a blood-curdling shriek of some hellish monstrosity reverberated through the halls. A primal scream of pure rage and torment. It was like nothing I had ever heard, and Tom and I both stood transfixed in terror. Celine's terrified scream followed a split second later, cutting through me like a serrated blade. "Help! Help!" Her voice was shrill with panic as she screamed again. I tore down the dimly lit hallway as dread coiled in my gut, cold sweat plastering my shirt to my back. All I could think was, dear God, what madness has been unleashed in this God-forsaken house. As I rounded the corner to the family's private quarters, I slid on shards of glass that littered the floor, glinting like twisted diamonds in the moonlight. What had once been a stained glass window lay shattered, colorful fragments strewn across the parquet floor. Celine screamed again, "Hurry!" We couldn't move fast enough as the hallway stretched into a claustrophobic eternity. Celine's anguished cries grew louder, punctuated by broken sobs. Tom and I burst through the double doors into the opulent master suite. Celine hunched on the floor in her silk nightgown, cradling Yaya's limp form in her arms. Celine's eyes were wild, tears shining in streams down her face as she cried, "Ambulance! We need an ambulance!" I stood rooted in place, thinking this can't be real, like a scene from Bosch's Hell or a Lovecraftian nightmare realm. Tom raced past me, making a beeline for the hall and a phone. My eyes darted to the half-open door leading to the children's room, where 2 small, pale faces peered out, eyes wide in terror. Stomach churning, I forced myself to move, crossing the room in a few unsteady strides. I crouched down, trying to block their view of their grandmother. Hey, it's okay," I whispered, my voice cracking. "We're going to get an ambulance. She's going to be all right. Help is coming." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. Safety is only an illusion, a comforting fiction we tell ourselves and our loved ones, and in this moment, I understood that with a dreadful sinking certainty. I reached out to pull the door shut to shield the children from further horror when Celine's voice cut through the room. "Will!" Just my name, but spoken in a cold, flat tone, devoid of inflection. It sent a chill skittering down my spine. I turned to face her. She was still kneeling, Yaya clutched to her chest, but her gaze was fixed on the doorway behind me, the doorway leading to the hall. "Will," she repeated, a tremor taking over her voice. I followed her gaze, a leaden sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach and my heart jackhammering against my ribs as the creature stared at me. Feral yellow eyes bore into mine, glowing with intelligence. Its form shimmered and blurred like a mirage, shifting between translucent shadow and grotesque corporeality, matted fur covering an unholy amalgamation of ape and man. It opened its maw, and a guttural snarl revealing rows of crooked fangs came forth. At first I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. A shimmer in the air, a distortion, like heat rising from summer asphalt, wavering as it stood glowering. The beast stood in the doorway as a scream built in my throat, but emerged only as a strangled gasp. The creature's lips peeled back in an expression of dominance as it stepped forward, its talon-like claws clacking on the hardwood floor. Behind me, the children began to wail, high and thin. Celine sobbed, a broken, hopeless sound, and I could only move between them and the beast, likely a pointless sacrifice as the world I thought I knew shattered to 1,000 shards of madness. The creature stalked towards me, its movements fluid and predatory. It paused mere inches away, close enough that I could feel the rage radiating from its misshapen body. It leaned in, nostrils flaring as it inhaled deeply, just as it had for the past 2 nights outside my door. I was paralyzed. My mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the impossible with the undeniable sight before me. It defied every law of nature, every shred of sanity, but here it stood, a twisted mockery of reality. The beast reared back, letting out another blood-curdling shriek of rage that shook the room. The children's screams reached a fever pitch, and Celine's desperate cries nearly lost the cacophony of terror. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature turned and stalked toward the door through which Tom had disappeared. It paused at the threshold, casting one more glance over its shoulder, and then vanished into the air before us. In its wake, a silence descended upon the room, broken only by the ragged gasps of our collective breathing. My heart hammered against my ribs, and cold sweat drenched me. Celine just rocked back and forth, Yaya's body cradled in her arms. Her eyes were wide and haunted. The children had rushed to their mother and clung to her, their faces pale and streaked with tears. But beyond the door, the sound of crashing and screaming began anew. Jen's piercing scream rocked me back into consciousness. My eyes darted between the trembling family and the door. Celine's voice cut through my indecision. "Will, you must help her!" I hesitated for a heartbeat, the weight of responsibility bearing down upon me like a physical force. But Jen screamed again desperately, and I left. I raced towards the sound, my feet pounding across shattered glass and polished hardwood, and as I neared the library, the acrid stench assaulted my nostrils again, a wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm me. Steeling myself, I burst through the door, only to be greeted by a scene of unimaginable carnage. Jen knelt on the floor, her hands pressed against Tom's head in an attempt to stem the flow of crimson that seeped between her fingers. Her eyes, once so full of life, now stared sightlessly at the ceiling. And there, looming over them like a malevolent sentinel, stood the creature, its form shimmering and wavering, caught between two worlds, eyes burning with that feral intelligence. But in that moment, it was an object that caught my gaze. The primitive bowl that had arrived on the same day that I did. And an idea of realization washed over me, cold and unforgiving. This thing, this embodiment of terror, was somehow connected to that enigmatic relic. As if sensing my presence, the creature turned its head, eyes locking with mine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and I was certain that it would lunge for me, its talons poised to rend flesh from bone. Instead, it shimmered and faded, its form growing translucent until it vanished altogether, leaving behind only the coppery tang of blood and echoes of Jen's anguished sobs. Tom regained consciousness within moments of the creature disappearing. Yaya was not so fortunate, and as we realized that Tom had never made it to a phone before Jen slammed him across the forehead with a broken chair leg, we quickly bundled up the old woman and drove the winding mountain roads at a breakneck pace to reach the hospital. Celine and the children sat forlornly in the waiting room, and I couldn't imagine what it was like to lose a husband and father, and then a grandmother, in such a short amount of time. As the first light of dawn swam through the windows, a doctor arrived with the news. It had been a massive coronary that nobody could have survived. I stayed with the children as Celine made the arrangements, and then we drove home in complete silence. Celine put the children to bed, and then returned to the library while I spoke with Jen, and Tom was resting, having taken quite a knock, but he didn't appear to have a concussion. Jen quietly told me what had happened, describing hearing something running down the hall and thinking it was the beast. As soon as Tom made it into the room, she smashed his head with her makeshift weapon. It was the kind of story that might even be humorous were it not for the circumstances surrounding it. It suddenly occurred to me that Henri was missing. But Jen said that there was no sign of the chef and that one of the cars had been missing from the garage. Celine arrived, and we three walked through the house surveying the damage. There was broken glass everywhere, and it would take more than the three of us to clean it up. Celine paused, and I expected her to say that we would just take the rest of the day to recover. Instead, she spoke in a quiet but firm voice. We have just enough time to straighten up the foyer and library so that I might be on time today for my meetings. The shock I felt was mirrored on Jen's face, but Celine did not wait for a reply and began collecting pieces of broken wood from the rug. I had so many questions, so many ideas of what was more important than making a meeting, but something had changed within Celine and no conversation was offered. I resigned myself to planning while I cleaned and figured out how to approach the situation before dark. At some point, when the rooms had been made presentable and closed doors would prevent anyone viewing the areas that weren't, Celine left to go get ready. Jen went to check on Tom, and I took advantage of the moment to walk outside. I did not have to travel far to find it. It was a third cairn, constructed in a spot that had been empty when I had walked here yesterday afternoon. It was no less a shock, despite my having suspected it would be there, but as I made my way back to the house, pieces of a puzzle began to form together in my mind. I rounded the corner to find Jen packing a Jeep, and as I walked past the garage, I wondered if there had been words between her and Celine. As I entered through the back door, I heard a noise in the kitchen and decided to go for broke. I called out to Celine as I banged the dirt off my shoes. I might have found something. The creature or ghost or whatever it is somehow connected to the large pot that was in the driveway the day I arrived. That crate was packed in dirt, not the usual foam peanuts. And I don't know if Tom showed you, but each night something is building cairns on the property. I think this beast may want us to bury... I walked into the kitchen to find a man standing there, not Celine. He wore a tailored suit and an old-fashioned bowler hat over a gaunt frame with a thin face and less than straight teeth. When he spoke, it was in a very clipped and crisp voice. An astute observation. I can see why Miss Christopoulos keeps you in her service. Would you care for tea? From across the room, Celine said in a cold tone, No, Mr. Vale was just leaving. The man tisked and said, That's a pity. I would rather have heard more of what the young man has to say. Celine's tone was pure frost. Perhaps another time. Will, please see to the children while Mr. Behrens and I move to the library. Mr. Behrens smiled thinly and tipped his hat to me as they walked in the direction that Celine had motioned with her hand. The children were still asleep, and I collapsed into a chair in the sitting room outside. I planned what I wanted to say when Celine returned, and no matter what her response, I had no intention of staying in this house another night. I would implore her to stay somewhere else so that we could all be safe. From there we could plan what to do for the children's lessons, but there was no way we were going to stay here. It seemed like hours later when Celine finally returned. How are the children, she asked, in a voice that had regained some of its warmth, but not all of it. They haven't made a peep, I said, and she went into the room to check on them. Poor darlings, they've been through so much, she spoke softly as she closed their door and turned back towards me. We should speak in the library. I nodded in agreement. We definitely needed to speak, and I readied my case. As we entered, Mr. Behrens was seated on a leather couch, smiling. Celine walked to a bureau, reached into a drawer, and counted out bills, placing them in an envelope. She turned and presented it to me. I've included the entire amount we discussed for the summer. I'm sorry that our plans must end early, but I do thank you for everything, Will, truly. I stumbled for what to say. You can't stay here. She shook her head. I have no intention of doing so. The children and I will return to France. We leave for Boston this afternoon. I was shocked. Oh, all right. Well, that sounds like a good idea. She nodded. Yes, things will be better for us there. I'm sorry that the children won't be able to say goodbye, but Mr. Behrens has graciously offered to give you a ride back to the city. He does need to leave quickly, but he'll wait while you gather your things. short time later, I found myself in the back of a limousine, sitting across from Mr. Behrens. He smiled. I meant what I said earlier. That was an astute observation. You seem to have a knack for this business. The entire experience was surreal to me. So, the bowl does need to be buried. He nodded emphatically. Oh, yes. Otherwise, you've seen how the Codiello will react. I did my best to mirror his pronunciation. The Codiello, is that what you call that thing? He nodded. It's one of the names that the tribes of Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda use for it. He took on a sly expression. Would you like to know what it is? I didn't bother to pretend that I didn't. Very well. For lack of a more accurate description, the spirit of a beast is imprinted within the bowl. The bowl is then used as an artifact of protection. I scoffed. Protection? That thing is not protecting anyone. He arched his brow. Was it not? You can see that the beast did not directly harm anyone in the house. And if I'm not mistaken, a member of the staff left of his own accord without announcing his departure. I would not be surprised to find that Henri had designs contrary to those of the family. Had the proper traditions been followed, I believe you would have found the beast to be quite a potent guardian. I considered his words, echoes of what Celine had said. It all spun around in my mind like a tornado, a maelstrom that would need time and rest to make sense of. Still, the immediacy of it all demanded questions. What happens now? Will somebody bury the pot? Behrens smiled. Yes, my company has agreed to care for several of the artifacts that Ephthemios managed to acquire over the years. All will be taken care of. Have no concern. It was my turn to crease my brow. Who's your company? Mr. Behrens reached inside of his lapel and withdrew a business card to hand to me. Tenser and Moss, auctioneers, sales and acquisitions. In a lowered voice, he said, You really do seem to have the knack. You should come by our building for a tour. I think you would find what we do to be very interesting and quite profitable. Profitable, I repeated. Quite, he said. I pushed the card into my pocket, next to the envelope Celine had given me, and leaned back into the leather seats. I don't mind telling you, Mr. Behrens, it's been a very strange few days for me. He smiled and replied, Life is funny that way, Mr. Vale, and it seldom turns out the way that we expect. It was nearly dark by the time we reached my apartment, and I was exhausted as I climbed the stairs. It felt like years had passed, even though it had only been a few days, and I nearly tripped on the object that had been placed by my front door. It was a plant, in a small pot, with a note attached. It read, Sorry to hear that the job didn't work out as planned, but you were given a glowing reference. I'm sure things will work out better the next time. Michael. I let myself in and firmly locked the door behind me. I left the pot outside. The end.